On the night of March 27, 1971, 50 North Vietnamese Army sappers cut through the perimeter wire of Firebase Mary Ann in Quang Tin Province and walked into an American base where most of the 231 soldiers inside were asleep. They knew the layout, they knew the guard rotation, they knew exactly where the command post was. They moved through the base for nearly 30 minutes before anyone raised a serious alarm. When it was over, 33 Americans were dead and 83 were wounded. It was one of the deadliest single enemy attacks on an American firebase in the entire war, and what the subsequent investigation found was not a story of heroic resistance overwhelmed by superior force. It was a story of negligence so complete, so systemic, and so inexcusable that the Army spent the next 2 years trying to decide what to do about it, and ultimately decided to do almost nothing. For say, Mary Ann sat on a hilltop at an elevation of roughly 1,000 feet in the mountains of Quang Tin Province, about 25 miles west of Tam Kỳ. It was home to Company C and Company D of the 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry, 23rd Infantry Division, better known as the Americal Division. The Americal Division carried its own dark history into that night. It was the same division that had produced the perpetrators of the My Lai massacre 3 years earlier. By March 1971, the Americal was in the process of standing down as part of Nixon's Vietnamization program, the gradual withdrawal of American combat forces and transfer of responsibility to the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Firebase Mary Ann was scheduled to be turned over to South Vietnamese forces within weeks. The men stationed there knew they were almost done. The war, for them personally, was nearly over. That knowledge produced a state of mind that the Army's investigation would later describe with clinical precision as a fatal relaxation of combat vigilance. The NVA unit that attacked Firebase Mary Ann was the 409th Sapper Battalion. Sappers were not ordinary infantry. They were elite combat engineers trained specifically to penetrate fortified positions, to move through wire obstacles silently, to identify and neutralize defensive positions, and to place explosive charges with precision. They trained for months on mock-ups of their targets. Before the attack on Mary Ann, they had conducted reconnaissance of the firebase over an extended period. Former South Vietnamese workers who had been inside the wire were debriefed. The sappers knew the base. They had studied it the way a surgeon studies an anatomy diagram before making the first cut. They came in at 2:58 a.m. The wire was cut in multiple places simultaneously. They moved in teams, each with a specific objective: the command post, the artillery positions, the ammunition storage, the communications center. They carried AK-47s, satchel charges, and RPG launchers. They were wearing dark clothing and had blackened their faces and hands. Several entered the base dressed in clothing similar to South Vietnamese civilian workers. The first American soldier to detect them was Specialist 4 Jose Flores, who was on guard duty at a bunker on the eastern perimeter. Flores saw movement and challenged. He was killed before he could fire his weapon. The attack had begun and almost no one knew it yet. The first satchel charge detonated at the command post at 3:03 a.m., 5 minutes after the sappers entered the wire. Captain Paul Spielberg, the company commander, was in his quarters. The blast destroyed the Tactical Operations Center and killed or wounded most of the soldiers inside before anyone could organize a coherent defense. The radios that might have called for immediate fire support were destroyed in the first minutes. Illumination rounds that might have exposed the attackers were not fired for nearly 10 minutes after the attack began, because the soldiers responsible for firing them were either dead, wounded, or in the confusion of the initial assault unable to locate or operate their equipment. For approximately 30 minutes, Firebase Mary Ann was a killing ground. Soldiers stumbled out of bunkers into darkness filled with explosions and gunfire without knowing where the enemy was or how many of them there were. Some were killed leaving their sleeping positions. Others were wounded by friendly fire in the confusion. The sappers moved with practiced efficiency through the base, placing charges, engaging targets of opportunity, and withdrawing through the same gaps in the wire they had entered through. By 3:30 a.m., they were gone. The attack had lasted 32 minutes. 33 Americans were dead. 83 were wounded. The 409th Sapper Battalion lost approximately 15 men. The aftermath was devastating in ways that extended beyond the casualty figures. Journalist Creighton Burns, writing in the Melbourne Age, described Mary Ann as the worst American military disaster since Tet. The comparison was not entirely fair. Tet had been a nationwide offensive, but as a single firebase attack, Mary Ann had no equal in the final years of the war. The question everyone was asking, in the immediate aftermath and in the months that followed, was not how the NVA had done it. That part was understood. The question was how the United States Army had allowed the conditions for it to exist. The Army's investigation, conducted by Lieutenant General William McCaffrey, took months and ran to thousands of pages. Its findings were damning. The investigation found that the firebase's defensive posture had deteriorated catastrophically in the weeks before the attack. Listening posts outside the wire, which were supposed to provide early warning of enemy approach, had not been consistently manned. Claymore mines on the perimeter had been improperly positioned or not positioned at all. The perimeter wire itself had gaps that had not been repaired. Alert rosters had not been followed. Officers had not conducted nighttime inspections of guard positions. The base's early warning radar had been inoperative for weeks. In short, Firebase Mary Ann had abandoned the basic defensive discipline that kept soldiers alive, and its officers had allowed that abandonment to occur and continue. The investigation recommended disciplinary action against 14 officers, ranging from letters of reprimand to relief from command. The officer most directly responsible for the firebase's defensive posture, Lieutenant Colonel William Donahue, the battalion commander, was recommended for a general officer's reprimand and relief from command. Captain Paul Spilberg, the company commander, received a similar recommendation. Above them, the investigation found fault with Colonel Joseph Wagstaff, the brigade commander, and Major General James Baldwin, the division commander. Then the Army processed those recommendations through its own institutional hierarchy, and something happened that was entirely predictable and entirely unacceptable. The punishments evaporated. By the time the recommendations worked their way up the chain of command to General Creighton Abrams, the commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, the appetite for severe punishment had diminished considerably. Abrams approved letters of reprimand for some officers. Others received lesser administrative actions. No one was court-martialed. No one faced criminal charges. The men who had allowed Firebase Mary Ann's defenses to collapse to the point where 50 NVA sappers could walk through the wire and kill 33 sleeping Americans faced career consequences that were, in most cases, manageable. The Army's reasoning, never stated plainly but visible in the record, was institutional self-protection. A court-martial of a battalion commander for negligence resulting in mass casualties would have required the Army to put on trial not just William Donahue, but the entire culture of Vietnamization-era combat operations, the declining morale, the drug use, the fragging incidents, the pervasive knowledge among American soldiers that the war was functionally over and that dying in it now was meaningless. The Army was not prepared to have that conversation in public. The press did it instead. Time magazine published a detailed account of the attack and its aftermath in June 1971. The coverage was withering. The specific failures were laid out in terms any civilian could understand. Guards who had been asleep, wire that had not been checked, radar that had not been repaired, officers who had looked the other way because the base was being turned over soon anyway. Time's reporting reached a public that was already exhausted by Vietnam and added to its exhaustion a specific, documented example of the war's terminal decay. Private First Class Louis Rocco was one of the soldiers at Firebase Mary Ann that night. He was wounded in the initial attack and continued fighting despite his wounds, at one point dragging wounded soldiers to safety under fire. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions during the attack, the only Medal of Honor awarded for actions at Firebase Mary Ann. Rocco's citation described extraordinary valor under circumstances of absolute chaos. His decoration stood in direct contrast to the administrative letters of reprimand received by the officers whose negligence had created those circumstances. One man received the Medal of Honor. His commanders received paperwork. The soldiers who survived Firebase Mary Ann came home to the same America that received all Vietnam veterans in 1971, which is to say they came home to a country that largely did not want to look at them. The attack was extensively covered for several months and then receded from public memory. The officers who received reprimands retired. Some had subsequent careers in business and civil life. The 33 men who died on the hilltop in Quang Tin Province were added to the casualty rolls of a war that was winding down and received the standard notifications sent to next of kin. No comprehensive memorial exists specifically for the dead of Firebase Mary Ann. The men's names are on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, lost among 58,279 others. The investigation files are in the National Archives. The Time magazine coverage is in library archives. The story of what happened on that hilltop on the night of March 27, 1971, is available to anyone who looks for it. Most people never look. If you want to understand more about the Vietnam War's final years and the cost of a war that had already been lost before it ended, there is a video on screen right now that goes deeper. Subscribe. These are the stories that deserve more than a footnote.